This is BeerSmith episode number 115, and it's early November 2015. Randy Mosher joins me this week to talk about the true history of beer. Thank you to this week's sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're now offering 6 issues a year, up from 4 at a great discount. There's a new discount code which gives you 15% off everything they sell, including subscriptions and training. The code is BeerSmith 2015. I encourage you to check out this great new magazine for homebrewers at beerandbrewing.com and use the offer code BeerSmith 2015 to get your 15% discount today. And also, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to your desktop brewing software. It includes all the tools you need to create recipes on the go, share them with friends, and act as a pocket brew timer. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or go to the Google Play Store, iTunes, or Amazon App Store. And now let's jump into this week's episode. My guest today is Randy Mosher, author of the new book, Mastering Homebrew, as well as Radical Brewing and Tasting Beer. Randy has a new website where you can learn about all things brewing from randymosher.com. Randy, it's great to have you on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Brad. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it was nice seeing you a couple weeks ago, and we were both out at the Wisconsin Beer Festival, right?
Yeah, at the Harley Museum.
That was awesome.
Super cool.
So you did a presentation there, and I hadn't seen it, but you also did it, I guess, at the AHA. It was entitled "Almost Everything You Know About Beer History Is Wrong." Can
That's
you
right.
tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the people have been working on this for years, but we have a lot of bad literature in our stories. And, it's like if you've ever seen the Antiques Roadshow, somebody's on there and there's this quilt, right? And grandma says that whatever it is, maybe Abraham Lincoln died on the quilt or something. And it turns out that the fabric's wrong and the pattern wasn't invented until later. And so the family's lost this great story. And it's kind of like that with beer. We have things that have just sort of agglomerated into the standard canon of beer literature, and sort of people pick it up and repeat it. And then it gets into a book and people pick it up and put it in BJCP and whatever. And so, we generally tend to not question that kind of stuff too much. It's difficult living in a world where you have to be suspicious about every single little thing you see or read. But, if you're trying to do history, you kind of have to think that way.
And I mean, as humans, we tend to glom onto stories, don't we? We tend to attach ourselves to them, and that's kind of how we pass information down from generation to generation.
Yeah, it's really the way our brains work. Like I said in the talk, you could take the major tenets of any religion and put them on a single sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper in bullet point form. But you look at the Bible, for example, it's 2,000 pages or so of stories and stories and stories, because that's what it takes to kind of pound it through our thick heads.
So beer history in particular is a difficult subject. There's a lot of myths involved. What are some of the challenges in seriously pursuing beer history?
Well, the problem is, again, that people tend to pick these stories up and they get lifted up from one source and put down into another source and without really being critically questioned. And also because it's not public history, it's mercantile history, private history. So people tend to keep their trade secrets secret, and they weren't like wars and great men and giant economic activities that tended to really get chronicled and written about. And so it becomes part of that, I guess sort of a folk life thing, and that great shift in history that's occurred in the last generation or so, from the sort of great men and big events theory to really trying to figure out how people lived and what they did in their day-to-day lives. And I think that beer sort of falls into other things. So it wasn't necessarily really chronicled or recorded all that well. And of course, then a lot of the recording and chronicling of it was done from a self-promotion point of view or a marketing point of view. And so I think a lot of these stories, maybe that old IPA thing, I know some of those appeared pretty early on in marketing literature. And having done that myself, I can tell you specifically, the marketing people are not historians, and they'll latch onto a good story and put it out into their materials without really giving it the kind of scrutiny that a historian would. It's just a different kind of application. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of hidden. Brewers didn't necessarily want to share their secrets. And actually, recipes, we're living in a very different world where we have access to hundreds of different ingredients. But if you brewed beer in 19th century Germany, you used the kind of malt that was available in the town, which was usually one kind of malt, and you made that beer. And so you've got huge books on brewing that have no recipes in them at all, because that was sort of figured to be like, oh, that's the trivial part. Everybody knows what they taste like. So they'll give you the chemistry as they understood it, but not always a lot of details about the beers.
So you're saying some of the marketing people may not be telling the whole truth here, Randy?
That's what I'm saying, Brad. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's possible.
I was that. I can tell you people make stuff up.
Well, in addition, a lot of our favorite beer styles have changed quite a bit over time. Can you give us a couple examples of beer styles that may taste nothing like the historical beer?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I have this theory, well, not really theory, but I think beers follow what they call an evolution punctuated equilibrium, right? So things kind of go along the same for a while until the external conditions change, and then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose and everything changes. And I think if you look at IPA in America, for example, even in that short, like in a 10-year period, the beers that we were drinking 10 years ago, we were calling IPA, were darker, much more caramelly and raisiny, and not as aromatically hoppy, and probably not as bitter either. And that goes for amber and red ales and pale ales and all of those styles. So there's like a hugely rapid evolution. Oktoberfest beer too. Even 10 years ago there was Märzen / Oktoberfest, which were generally considered to be the same thing, and then a somewhat lighter, drier style called Vienna at about 1% alcohol lower. Today we have three styles. We have the Märzen, we have the Vienna, and now we have an Oktoberfest beer that every year seems to get a little paler. And I've even heard some Germans talking about that the breweries are upset about so many foreign and especially American, what they call beer corpses, people who have passed out at Oktoberfest, that they're actually thinking about making the beer considerably lighter so people can still stay and drink it and not get so hammered. So that's a style, even an old traditional style that goes back sometime, well into the 19th century. And all of a sudden we have this rapid evolution of it. So it's pretty interesting to watch.
And if we go even farther back in history, I assume probably the beers are nothing like what they were back then, right?
Well, yeah, porter, porter is just kind of crazy that it changed every generation, more or less. And because of improvements in brewing technology and economics, and even within that one style, which was fairly well defined, you have people in the 19th century saying you can tell any single London brewer's porter on taste because everybody brews it differently. And so even within that style that I think that's a style nobody feels like they really know all that well. Whenever I judge it, everybody's like, I don't know, what are we doing here? What's the deal? So
weren't a lot of the original porters done over smoked malt too? The malt was smoke dried, right? It was dried over wood fires, right?
But it was done even into the 20th century to some degree over wood fires. They used oak or hornbeam, but the idea was to get a really crackling, roaring fire. And in that situation, you don't have a ton of smoke, but you do get a little bit what they called empyromatic or smoky flavor. So those brown malts would have had a bit of smokiness to them for sure.
Well, what sources are available for somebody who wants to seriously study historical beers?
Well, you can look at the actual books, at the brewing literature, and fortunately, that's one of the things that the internet has brought that's really great. Of course, there's a lot of bad information on the internet because it's so easy to cut and paste. So you have, there's a lot of stuff on there. You have to really weed through it, and because it's not necessarily all that accurate. But at the same time, you can go on Google Books or Project Gutenberg, or there's some other sources, and have access to many tens of thousands of dollars of antique brewing books. The London and Country Brewer, for example, a really fascinating book that was written in the when was that book published? Early 1800s, I think. And fascinating book. And by that point, you can kind of recognize the recipes and the weights and measures all sort of make sense for modern sensibilities. And so you can make a lot of sense out of that book. And there's a ton of them. If you can read French or German, you're better off. Well, that's an additional advantage because there's books in those languages as well. But that's an incredible resource. And of course, there are historians out there writing about beer that you can really trust. There's Martin Cornell and Ron Pattinson. I think Ron's in Amsterdam now, and Martin's in England, of course.
Yeah, we've had Ron on the show. It was quite a while ago now, but
and I think they're little unsung heroes over here because they're not really a direct part of the U.S. scene. People kind of aren't as aware, but they both have fabulous websites, and I would highly recommend checking them out because they really dig deep, and they both managed to get access to a lot of brewery archives and through breweries themselves or through historical societies, and they've made a lot of headway in going through the old recipes and kind of decoding the recipes because the recipes tended to be written in shorthand a little bit for brewers, and it isn't always, you can't just look at an old brewing recipe and understand what it is. It takes time to kind of dig in and figure out what their abbreviations mean and everything. But so they've done a ton of work. And so highly recommend those guys.
I pulled up Ron's site. It's shutupaboutbarclayperkins.com.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that phrase was what his kids said to him because he was just like going on and on about this old brewery in London. And Ron's is Zithophile, I think is the name of, or I'm sorry, Martin's is Zithophile. And they both have books, so definitely check them out. Lots of great information in there. Ron has a book out fairly recently that's all homebrew recipes for based on these old recipes. So lots of really great information. And of course, Stan Hieronymus is a ferocious researcher and has done some really good work. The Brew Like a Monk book, and he's actually collecting data for a book on sort of beers in that category of other that use spices and herbs and things. And I've been interesting talking to him about what his travels and what he's been doing. So he's a highly reliable writer. And of course that Mitch Steele book on IPA, he worked with Mark, I think, and Ron also. But so that's a pretty well vetted. There's also another book called I think it's just called The History of Beer and Brewing by a guy named Ian Hornsey. Hornsey. It's an academic book, mostly English focused, but very good source. So there's that material.
And then of course there's randymosher.com as well.
Yeah,
right? Your new website.
It's tidbits on there, right? So it's not highly structured. You're not going to go on there and learn the history of beer. But what Brad's showing right now is actually a map that I put together for this presentation on Belgian beer in 1851, according to an author named Georges Lacambre. And what's striking about it is how little of it actually lines up with what our modern day notions of Belgian beer is. And, you do see wit beer on there, Lambic, of course, because, we all know that's ancient. Beers over in Dutch-speaking Flanders, the names are different, but they sort of look like sour red and browns and even sour pales over there. But everything else is completely alien. It's very funny, very interesting to see how different it was back then and how much has changed. How much of what we think of as essentially Belgian is just not in that book at all.
Now, Randy, you've also done some interesting work from images, artifacts, and pictures. Can you provide or talk about a few examples of that?
Well, yeah, I'm a visual artist, and so I love pictures. I think people learn visually. That's one of the things, of course, I try and do in my books. I was looking for something else, and I came across an image of a ceramic boot, and that kind of got my attention. I looked at it a little closer, and it's beautiful clay boot that has some like stitching molded in. It looks to be I don't know exactly how big it is, but drinking glass size. Beautiful decoration on it. The rim flares out, and it turns out to be a drinking boot from ancient Persia. So, and this is what's great about history is that when you really do it right and you get that great information, you come face to face with yourself in the past. So here's the ancient Persians. These are the guys that kicked the Greeks' ass back there in 300 BC or whenever that was. And they're sitting around the campfire playing a drinking game with a boot, and everybody thought the Germans invented that. But it turns out it was actually the ancient Persians, because you cannot drink out of a boot-like thing and not notice that whole trick with the boot where you drink out of it, and then all of a sudden you get that big rush of beer when that toe finally lets loose and the beer drops in your face. And that's the game part, is trying to not do that. So and then there's a ton of labels online. I've been scouring eBay for 12 or 15 years now, not necessarily buying everything I can, because a lot of that stuff's pretty expensive, but downloading JPEGs and just storing them up and using them for research purposes. And it's amazing what you find. I mean, we all think about lambic as being from Brussels, but I've got a lambic label. Not only is it from Leuven, which is the next town to the east, where that's famous for wit beer, but it's also brewed by Brasserie Artois, famous now for Pilsner, Stella Artois, right? But at one point they made a lambic, and so that's pretty wacky. I've got a brown lambic, a brown goose. I've got a goose label that says sans acide carbonique, meaning without carbonation. So that blows up our whole notion that goose was created specifically as a carbonated beer, because there's a clear example where it wasn't. One wasn't, at least. And so we have these notions, everything gets codified in these style guidelines. I'm not anti-style guidelines by any means, but I do think we have to be a little bit careful. And I knew they put a lot of work into trying to keep them updated and things, but the commercial reality in any given time and place is always a lot more complex than what you could distill down into a style guide. That's just the fact. And I think that exists today as well as it existed 100 or 200 years ago. So, but I do love those visuals, and it's really great. There's a lot of old magazine articles where they used to do wood engravings and things, and quite often you'll get a little bit more of a day-to-day feel for the life and operation of breweries from these articles that are written for the general public than you will from articles that are written by and for brewers, and because they all tend to focus on the mechanical and very specific engineering and process details, where the popular articles, they give you a lot more kind of a general overview of things. So those can be pretty interesting, and they're all that stuff's up there on the internet for sale or just to look at, or old postcards, lots of great information. I've been collecting brewery images in Belgium and northern France just to kind of see I'm sort of digging into what farmhouse means, and turning out to be not very farmhouse looking, really very much about much larger operations than we would think of as farmhouse. So lots and lots of stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with something like porter. What is some of the real history behind this very popular beer style? My understanding is late 1700s, it was just incredibly popular, right?
Yeah, so porter, the earliest use of the word porter occurs somewhere around 1720. We know they were brewing a beer like that before. London of course, they had the Civil War in the 1630s, I think it was, and then in 1661, London had a case of plague, or 1663 maybe, and then in 1666, the whole north banks of the Thames burned down. So the city was basically leveled, with the exception of Southwark and some of the neighborhoods to the south. And so that meant a lot of rebuilding, a lot of money coming into the town, a lot of people working. It was just like a really hyper charged economic environment. And so people were thirsty and had some money. And at the same time, they had cut some canals that allowed this cheap brown malt to come in from Hertfordshire. And now you got a style. Mm-hmm. And they just sort of called it brown ale or nut brown, or, sort of the terminology is fairly vague on it. But eventually by 1720, 1730, people were regularly calling it porter, after the guys that either unloaded docks or schlepped stuff around town, to just make deliveries and things. And then, every technological advance brought some change in the way porter was formulated. So what they were brewing with this brown malt, and not only was it kilned over these oak fires, but the rapid heating caused them to puff or pop or torrefy, as they say technically. And that torrefied malt because British brewers were buying by measure, by volume rather than by weight, because it was puffed up, they were getting a lot less weight per bushel or for quarter, which was a larger measure that brewers used. And so when you look at the by weight difference, the difference in extract isn't that much. And I always wondered, why did they throw all the brown malt out after Richardson did his studies with the hydrometer showing that the gravity was lower? But when you realize that they were buying by volume, then now you have a huge difference because it's poofier, it's lighter, so you just get a lot less stuff. So they threw all that out. And now the problem was, that's great. We're making beer. It's a lot cheaper to make, but now it's not brown anymore. So how are we going to get it brown? So they struggled for a generation or more with trying to get some color. Sometimes they use licorice. Sometimes they use this stuff called Essentia binae, which was a sugar that they boiled down and then set on fire in a kettle. And so it made a very concentrated concentrated black coloring. And then eventually this guy named Wheeler invented a kiln that was more or less a predecessor of a modern roasting or coffee roasting thing. And maybe he was using it for coffee at the time. I don't know. But so it kind of gave them a black malt that and that's why we call it patent malt, because it was originally a patented process for that kiln that had a rapid cooling thing built into it. And that was the real advance of it. So then now you have porter made with black malt. And that was in the around 1820. And right about that time, IPA was really starting to become very popular. And so porter at that time started fading. But if you look at the old recipes, it's just extremely different about every generation. The strengths are different. The hopping levels are different. The malt bills are different. So it really, really changed. And now, of course, we have porter styles that are sort of based on a private discussion between Charlie Papazian and Michael Jackson, where they were setting up beer styles for the homebrew competition or whatever they were doing. And they thought, well, we need a porter category, but it's a mess. What do we do with it? And they both kind of thought, well, we sort of need two. We kind of need one for something that's lighter and softer and more brown kind of. And we probably need one that's sort of a little bit bigger. But it's not, because nobody was really brewing porter at the time commercially, except in the Baltic. And, Yuengling was brewing what they called a porter, but it was really an American dark lager. So they were kind of making it up. And I pressed Charlie on it. It's like, yeah, we sort of just winged it, picked up, sort of made that up because we thought that's kind of what we needed. But it's not based on anything really. So
there weren't a lot of commercially produced porters. This would have been in the 70s, I assume, right?
There were none. I mean, there were none in England. There were some in Poland and Sweden and up the Baltic, but we never saw those in the United States, Finland. And then, like I said, the one at Yuengling in Pennsylvania, but you couldn't really call that a porter, even though they did. So there wasn't any guidance, any commercial examples that you could really point to. So they just thought, well, let's just throw this out there. Anchor brewed their first porter. I think that was 1973 or 74, maybe 74. So that may have been one, but that's a pretty eccentric porter. That has a ton of crystal malt in it. That's a really unusual recipe for that. So I would never say that that's archetypal of what a porter should be, but it's what they did. And it's certainly a delicious beer, but it's not, it's sort of made up.
And the other one I find interesting is India Pale Ale.
Sure.
This is this is one that has a lot of myths around it, right?
Well, yeah. So the story goes, that they started, England stomped into India looking for rubies and ivory and whatever, and kind of took over with the aid of the local upper classes and started exporting and importing. And of course, those ships, they're wooden ships. You can't sail them empty. And India didn't have a lot of money to buy anything that the English had to sell. So the English had to put cargo on there that was heavy. And so people who worked on those ships had free cargo space going to India. So beer's heavy, it's cheap. You can put it below the water line down where it's good ballast and, it'll help keep the ship afloat. So, of course, they sent a lot of porter because that's what they were making at the time. And then porter Then they also shipped a beer called October beer, which was usually kind of associated with the gentleman brewers gentleman farmers who had breweries on their property and brewed these beautiful high gravity. We would look at them today as sort of barley wines, but they were highly hopped. So hoppy barley wine, double IPA kind of things. And it's like, yeah, sure, let's throw that on the boat too. And eventually that trade was dominated by a guy named Hodgson, and he was a real jackass. Everybody hated him. He would cut his price when anybody else tried to come into the market, and he really eventually just pissed off the East India Company, who were the guys who were in charge of that. It was a very important organization made up of the very top strata of English society and mercantile activity. And those are guys you do not screw with. And Hodgson and his son eventually just got kicked out. And right at that same time, the Burton breweries, who had been making a thick, sweet, heavy beer called Burton Ale, had nothing to do with IPA. And they've been shipping it to Russia, but right about that time they had lost their contract, or actually Russia instituted some tariffs because they wanted to develop their own brewing industry up in Russia as they were starting to industrialize. So they kind of kicked the Burton brewers out. And the Burton brewer, there's a story in the Alsop literature that says that one of the Alsop guys was just hanging out at a gentleman's club, and somebody said, "Oh, did you hear Hodgson just got kicked out of India?" And he was thinking, "Oh, maybe there's an opportunity for me." So there's a famous story about how Alsop, they had to go to their maltster and tell the maltster, "You're going to have to make a different kind of malt because what we're making is too dark and the beer's too heavy, and we've got to make this lighter style of beer." And I think that's probably where the nucleus of that story came from, because it was reformulated for that specific purpose, but it wasn't until 40 years after IPA had been started to be shipped to England. And so the story, somebody was just telling me yesterday that, there was a famous story about a boat that went down outside of England on its way to India, and that they salvaged the beer, and it was a big success. Somebody said that they actually think that there is some historical basis to it, but how much that had to do with the growing popularity of IPA in England, pretty much a matter of conjecture at this point. But so it's fascinating to dig into all that and see where it all goes.
So it wasn't necessarily just a hoppy beer we threw out to survive the long trip to India. They were sending all kinds of beer to India at that point, right?
Well, they were sending porter, which they really were sending porter, and this October beer, which eventually they started calling India Ale or India Pale Ale. And porter at the time was a pretty hoppy beer. If you look at the original porters, they were as hoppy as IPAs, but just dark beer. So it wasn't, we have our modern notion of a porter is that it's always not hoppy beer, but originally it was a very hoppy beer. So again, it's easy to just have this knowledge set that's pretty simple and pretty clear, but harder for our little brains to hold a lot of really complicated information. So you have to kind of work at that.
Well, you also did a lot of research into the origins of lager. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I haven't. All I've done is sort of pick around the edges of the story. I haven't really done the kind of research that I would like to. I'm kind of hoping maybe some German will do it, because that would be the logical choice. I know Horst Dornbusch has done some work in this area, but I'm still feeling like I want a little more. They tell the story that lager beer originated from monks brewing in caves in the Alps, and just on the face of it, sometimes you just have to give everything that common sense test, and that doesn't pass, right? So like, you're brewing in the Alps, so it's winter up there a lot, and it's very hard to get up and down, and you got to get the barley up the hill, and then you got beer, and the people are not living up on the mountains, they're living down below in the valleys in town. Like, how are you going to get the beer down there? You got to build a pipeline. How good are the brakes on your ox cart is the big question.
I'd support a beer pipeline myself, but
yeah, a beer pipeline would be good, but it'd be made out of wood. It'd be prone to, or lead. They used to use lead for brewing implements back then sometimes, and so I think it just doesn't pass the basic test. And the other thing is that the caves are not a very good environment because they're not cold enough, right? Cave is the temperature of the upper part of the crust of the earth, and it's like 56 degrees, and that's an ale temperature, not a real lagering temperature. So that one doesn't pass. It almost undoubtedly has something to do with the fact that they prohibited the winter brewing or prohibited summer brewing of stronger beers, and only allowed strong beers to be brewed and allowed strong beers to only be brewed in the winter. But that was true in Belgium as well, and they never invented lagers. So it's still a bit of a mystery of how that happened. There's a whole questions with yeast too. We know that most lager strains are hybridized from a cold tolerant yeast that was recently identified in Patagonia, which caused a lot of furor because the timing is 100 years off at least on that. But then they found it in the Eurasian mainland, so they've got it in Tibet now. They think they'll probably find it a little bit further west. So that one seems to be put to bed. But yeast genomics, there's another source of information that's just starting to be exploited. I know Chris White and his folks at White Labs are doing a lot of really interesting work with a genomics company that started hanging out there at their tap room because it was sort of in the neighborhood, and then they're looking for a project to do some, because they make gene sequencing machines, and it's like, what'd be fun is we could sequence some brewer's yeast. So that's what they started doing a couple of years ago. So they're going to be they're working with people all over the world that are trying to make sense of this data and tease out some relationships between the various strains of yeast, and how to really build a family tree of yeast, I think, is sort of the big goal there. So that's pretty exciting.
So when do you think some of the first lagers were actually brewed?
That's another really good question. You have town documents in northern Bavaria that seem to support that seem to talk about things that sound like lager beer as early as the 1300s. And, the Reinheitsgebot talks about lager. That's 1516. That's in Bavaria. The Bavarians actually drank wine up until, about 1500 or so. They came a little late to the beer party. Even though I'm sure that's like a very heretical thing to do, because that's so much of their national identity in Bavaria is about beer, but actually it was a little bit more about wine earlier on. And further north in Franconia and Nuremberg and northern southern Germany, you do see a lot of brewing much earlier on, but just kind of crazy. And so we just don't really know. And so somebody needs to get all those records, dig into it, do a lot more investigating, tie in the yeast genomics, and really come up with an academic history of lager beer in Germany, because to my knowledge, it hasn't been done yet.
And speaking of Germany, even the Bock beer doesn't appear to have the origin that we thought it did, right?
Well, if you look at the style guidelines, again, there's a Bock, and it's dark. And I think the reason that there's a dark Bock in there is because in the United States in the 1970s, Bock was dark. That was the difference, right? So Bock beer, Pabst used to make a Bock, and Schlitz used to make a Bock. Me and my pals in college were always like, around the 1st of February, it's like, woohoo, we got some Bock beer. And really, it was nothing more than the regular lager with a little bit of caramel color squirted into it in most cases. And but we really kind of look forward to the seasonality of it. But so I think that idea that Bock was dark got into our American heads and drove our beliefs about the style guidelines. But if you actually go out and try and find a German single Bock that's dark, you're very hard pressed to do so. There are a few out there, but if you one of the things, again, with trying to use visual sources, I've got a couple of books that are paintings about art. Yeah. So there's
pull a couple up here for those of you watching the video.
There. One from, you can see the dates there. And that on the left, you see that that tall goblet with a short stem. That's called a pokal. That's very classic for Bock beer. Whenever you see that glass, it's a Bock. But also the title of these paintings all have something to do with Bock about them. And you can see from 1830 to 1900 that beer is definitely not brown. It's a deep amber colored beer. It's maybe Vienna malt at darkest, and it's also true in France. I've got some paintings from France from Edouard Manet showing Bock beer, and really all the single Bocks tend to be my Bocks. And I think that this notion of a dark Bock may have been just an American notion. Right now, I don't have enough support. I do certainly can see the paintings. I've never found a painting that shows a Bock that looks dark in color, but that's not proof that there wasn't any. So at this point, that's another open question. But I think most likely that's the case. I'm going to stick my neck out for that anyway.
So it's interesting. I mean, a lot of interesting origins here. And of course, Belgium is a Disneyland of beers. And you found some interesting things about beers like farmhouse ales and even a lot of the styles that are popular now in Belgium.
Yeah, sure. Well, like I said, I dug into this. I picked up this book by Lacombe, and he was a pretty important brewer. He brewed in Leuven at some large breweries, and he brewed in Ghent at an enormous brewery, like a city block or larger size brewery, really big operation. And he was using cast iron, cylindrical, steam jacketed, mechanically stirred pressure vessels to boil it. So that was the level of sophistication of this guy in the 1830s.
Pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. And so he was a guy that really modernized the wit beer brewing process from this incredibly arcane, complicated, difficult 7-hour process to something that resembles the modern wit beer process, and also coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, is virtually identical to what we would recognize as an American adjunct mashing process, where the unmalted grains are stepped up through mashing temperatures with a small amount of malt, and then eventually boiled and returned to the kettle.
Basically a cereal mash, right?
Lacombe invented that, right? So now I'm trying to find the citations from a guy named Anton Schwartz and another one called J.E. Siebel, who founded the Siebel Institute that I teach for, to try and find their early journal articles where they were writing about this to American audiences and see if they cite Lacombe, because they may well have. I don't have proof, but this is the way history goes. Like, you have these theories, and you build bridges out from both sides of the shore, and all you need is that little gap in the middle. You need sometimes just one data point, and as soon as you get that one thing, boop, everything clicks into place, and now you have verified history. But I can't say it's true until I have that citation, right? So that's the thing I'm missing there. But so this Lacombe book is a really important book because it was the first detailed book on Belgian brewing written by a Belgian for Belgians. And so huge amount of detail on there. And there's some other sources too. There's some great Journal of the Institute of Brewers articles written in English by some English brewers who were spending time in Belgium and in northern France, writing very detailed sort of on the ground accounts of the breweries a little later in around 1900. But so Lacombe's beer styles, he lists 14 beer styles, and of those ones, there are only 3 in there that in any way resemble the current beer styles that we would think of as Belgium. And the 2 most interesting omissions are Abbey and Trappist beer, and anything that we would in any way describe as being a saison or a farmhouse type of beer. Just not there at all.
So that's interesting because, of course, the Trappist ales we associate with the monasteries appear to be a more recent invention, right?
They're much more recent. One of the things, again, if you're trying to understand beer history, you can't do it by studying beer history alone, right? You have to understand the context of what was going on at any given time and place. Who's in charge, which country, how are they taxing things? What was there a plague or a fire or a war? That all has effects on things. And so, let's see, where was I going with this? Oh, so the French Revolution in 1789 shut down all the monasteries, like right now, today, and kicked all the monks out, shut them down, done. And
they seized all the land, didn't they?
I think so.
Yeah, that's what I understand. That's what they used to issue a currency. Actually, they seized all the land from the monks.
Yeah, because the church had been in collusion with the royalty. So the revolution was not just about the aristocracy, but they were equally angry with the church because the church had enabled the aristocracy, and the aristocracy gave the church a lot of money and certain privileges in exchange for their collusion. And so they were basically persona non grata. So then you have at least, well, let's see, the 1789 to 1833, I think was the date. state. So you have a very long, more than 40-year period, a long generation where there's nobody there, and people started trickling back into the monasteries and reopening them after the Dutch got in charge of Belgium after the Napoleonic debacle. So and in La Cambre, there's no wistful longing for those old days when, boy, do you remember those old days when we had these Abbey beers that were so great? Nothing like that in there. And the World War I was pretty devastating. We knew that some of the breweries started brewing, or the monasteries started brewing a little bit in the mid 19th century and started selling a little beer to the public around 1900, but doesn't seem to be in any significant way. And then after World War I, you start to see, as the country's rebuilding itself, you start to see monasteries opening and beer being brewed and called Abbey, or called Trappist beer. You can see some of the dates there. And but at that time, what was coming into Belgium were English pale ales, and IPAs, Scottish ales, stouts, porters, Bock beers, blonde lagers, and Märtzens. Right. So if you think about a double and a Bock beer, kind of the same thing, really, in terms of a malt formulation and all of that. If you took a Doppelbock recipe, threw a little sugar in it, fermented it with Belgian yeast, pretty much got a double, right? So, or maybe a Scotch ale too, because a Scotch ale, Doppelbock, double, they're sort of really pretty similar in their flavor profiles in many, many ways. So, and I think triple also, that was created by Westmalle in the 1930s. And again, what's going on? Well, Pilsner is just kicking everybody's ass. People want pale beer. Pale, pale, pale. Give me pale beer. So the monks are no dummies. That's a commercial enterprise. They're trying to raise money to do good work on behalf of their religion. So, let's sell some beer, right? So they make a beer that's kind of the hot, trendy beer, which is Pilsner that everybody's drinking. So it's it doesn't take a great leap of imagination to see where that stuff was coming from. Because again, what you listen to these guys, George Maw Johnson, these other English guys in 1900 or so, and the Belgian industry was in complete state of disrepair, really small and dirty and not very inspiring, not very interesting, cheap products. Kind of sounded like everybody's sort of down in the dumps, really. And the Germans were coming in and setting up breweries to do lagers and things like that. But the homegrown breweries were really kind of struggling. So much so that Henri van Leer, who was the head of the Belgian Brewers Guild, actually set up a competition to create some new beers that they could sell as export products to compete with the beers that were coming in from the British Isles and from Germany. And so, of course, the rule was you had to publish your recipe, and nobody wanted to do that, so they only got 2 or 3 entries. And then they changed the rule the next time they did it, they got 75 entries or something like that. And some beers that still exist in the market today, Palm Special, I think, and a number of other beers that still exist over there came out of that competition. So that was really the beginning. And of course, then they had World War I, and it kind of tore up the country pretty bad. So it set them back a couple of decades. But
a lot of the resurgence really is after the 2 world wars, right?
Yeah, you start to see kind of a rebirth in between the wars. They rebuilt a lot of equipment. World War II certainly was bad for Belgium, but it wasn't there was popular postcards that you could buy after World War I that showed pictures of ruined breweries in Belgium. Like, that was a novelty postcard. People thought, oh, look how funny that is. There's a tore up brewery, and there's like bomb poles and walls falling down, and sometimes German soldiers standing in front of them. Everybody thought that was a great joke, but they did really, the place was just ruined. And as bad as things were in World War II, there's this great picture of Pierre Celis, the famous founder of Hoegaarden, really revived wit beer. He's standing in a brewery in 1943, right? That's right before, the year before D-Day. He's standing in this brewery. There's 3 or 4 other big, burly, fully able-bodied Belgian men in there in leather aprons standing behind their mash tun making beer. And so things couldn't have been that bad. I mean, I know a lot of the war was down south in the Ardennes and places like that, but it wasn't so completely devastated as it had been in World War I. So they got back on their feet. And that's when Belgian beer really started to become an important export product when we start to see a lot of cork and cage bottles and all those things kind of being sold and marketed as if the beer was a little bit like champagne and kind of had a little bit of a gloss to it like that increased its appeal, and it started to be exported and didn't really start to be a big export market into the U.S. until, gosh, when was it? Probably not till at least the late 1980s, because I remember when I started brewing in 1985, there were very, very few Belgian beers available at all in the Midwest, maybe a little bit more on the East Coast, but nothing like we have today. So even that's fairly recent.
So the other one you mentioned as being historically missing is farmhouse ales.
Yeah, it's sad. I just was helping Ray Daniels judge Cicerone Master Candidates, and we had a woman who's at a brewery in California, and I was telling her this story that I'm about to tell, and she's like, "I hate you now. I just spent 5 years working on this beer based on this idea, and now you're telling me that I wasted my 5 years." It's like, no. This is art. It doesn't have to be true. You just have to feel it, right? It just has to come from the heart. But basically, it's such a beautiful fiction, this notion of a hazy summer day, and they're brewing up this special beer for the farm workers, and it's sort of lovingly created from very local ingredients. It just pushes all our buttons here in 2015. It just, to Americans, it just sounds so great. We'd all like to kind of have that. But the fact is, for sure they were brewing on farms, but not recently. And if you look, again, I've been collecting a lot of photos. Brad just showed one here. Breweries were pretty significant commercial enterprises. La Cambra talks at one point about stirring a mash. He says you have to have 6 to 8 robust brewers stirring the mash. So now you got 8 brewers in the brewery. If you see that one picture, it's got, everything's horses at that time, right? So you got to have a guy they take a lot of maintenance and a lot of space and a lot of buildings, and you got to have people bringing the food and cleaning up their waste and taking care of them and taking care of the tack and harness stuff. Got to have a guy to drive, guys to lug. You're making your own barrels, so you got to have at least one cooper and probably an assistant. You could see them all in there. You can identify their trades because they're like standing with their stuff. Then you got brewers. You got a sales force of some kind or other that were in there working the market. You've got women in the brewery doing the kinds of jobs that women did in those days, which is probably feeding the men, taking care that the clothes are laundered and just keeping the place a little bit civilized, perhaps. So there's a dozen people or more in even a fairly small brewery. And that lines up with these descriptions.
Pretty big farmhouse, huh?
It's not a farmhouse, right? Maybe it's out in the country. DuPont, Brasserie DuPont in Tours, they call themselves a farmhouse brewery, but it's a brick building. It's a big compound. It's a couple city blocks worth of buildings and stuff. It's a pretty significant enterprise. And even these old pictures, those were not little things that we would really think of as farmhouses. They were kind of rural, but a lot of Belgium was rural. So the breweries tended to be out there. But, and even the beer itself, if you look at La Cambra, there was a beer called, L'Orge de Wallonie, which means barley beer of Wallonia. So it's in a big crescent that stretches from the southeast of Belgium in a city called Liège, that's today famous for extra good waffles, all the way down to that area of where now we would associate saisons in the western, in sort of through the Ardennes and into western Wallonia, around Tours, beyond Mons. And the beers there were amber or brown. They didn't really match up with what we would think of as modern saison type of beers. And even I looked at Michael Jackson's World Guide because I was thinking on this topic, and it's like, I wonder what he said in that book that was so important for everybody. And in that entire book, there's one sentence on saison that says, in southern Wallonia, some breweries call their blonde ales saisons. Right. End of statement. Right. So even in that, and he dug into everything. Right. If it was a thing, he would have written about it. And so at that time, it wasn't much of a thing, and it's become a bigger deal lately. And so the name has always been very problematic. They have this story that it comes from the word that saison is related to it means season, and because summer is a season, we call the beer saison. And that doesn't make any sense at all. That's just silly. And then you also hear that it was brewed for the saisonniers, who are the seasonal farm workers. Well, think about how people treat their farm workers. They're migrant workers. Not very well. And if you're going to give them beer, you're not going to give them your good stuff. And 6% beer was like the strongest beer in Belgium around 1900 or so. It was really, the beers were much weaker back then. So they would have been drinking something much more pitiful. And also the word saison, Le Cambre, this was another great gem in that Le Cambre book. Le Cambre says, saison means a beer brewed en saison, meaning in the proper brewing season, which means during the winter rather than all year. And so a saison indicated a strong beer, right? So they almost everywhere in Belgium, they brewed 2 strengths of beer, a strong one and a weak one, virtually the same recipe, just stronger or weaker. The weak ones they brewed all year round because they were in and out a couple of weeks, they're done. They didn't have a chance to kind of get spoiled. But the stronger beers, they knew if you're trying to brew when temperatures are warmer and there's all this horse poop dust flying around in the air in these agricultural regions, you're going to make terrible beer. So they prohibited it pretty much everywhere in continental Europe. It was a little different in Britain, but because summers are a little milder there. But so now we have saison. That's a strong beer. Again, not something you give to your farm workers. Mm-hmm. There was a beer called saison properly, made in that town Liège over there, but it was a amber-colored beer. It was very low in alcohol. It was very poorly attenuated, and they used a special yeast that they got from Maastricht, which is up near Holland in the northeast of Belgium, and it used malted spelt, oats, and sometimes, usually either buckwheat or broad beans. And Le Cambre describes it as being a very harsh drink and not very popular. But that was the only beer that was actually called something specifically a saison. So that's kind of a mystery. And of course, it jumped, that name jumped over to the other side of the country. We start to see labels. Probably they look like they're sort of between the war where people start using that term. But how they started pulling that term and sticking it on beers, these blonde beers, is still another mystery that we got to sort out.
Probably the marketers were involved. That's my guess.
Undoubtedly they were, because that, it's a business. You got to sell your beer, whatever story works.
Well, I want to switch gears. We could probably talk about Belgians all day, but I want to switch beers and just throw one more story in, which I think is kind of interesting. It's the origin of steam beer is one of the stories you tell.
Sure, yeah. Well, it is a historical reality that steam was a style of beer that existed in the American West. California, for sure. I've seen examples from Idaho and a few other places. But and generally, it was a type of beer that was brewed with lager yeast, but not at lager temperatures. Mm-hmm. Because during those days, most breweries in the East Coast were using ice cut out of lakes and rivers. And until refrigeration came into breweries, which was in practical terms not really until about the 1880s in the United States. And so you have these people, German brewmasters, bringing their yeast, doing the best they can. They're making this stuff called steam. The old books always say they call it steam because it was highly carbonated, and you get a little hiss of steam when you tap the kegs. I'm not sold on that, but they do agree. Also, the Germans use a term called Dampfbier to indicate a sort of a fake beer. They were making wheat beer without wheat because wheat was prohibited, and so they would use the wheat beer yeast with the barley beer with maybe some oats tossed in. And so steam had this connotation of kind of this ersatz attempt to do the best you can and create a flavor, even though you're not doing it exactly the right way. So those were draft beers mostly. By the time they started putting labels on the beers, there weren't very many of them left. So just a handful. This brewery in San Francisco was the last survivor. You can see the anchor on the lower left in that picture. And interestingly, that was originally the steam beer label. But when they made the steam beer, they used a different design, and they saved that label and put it on the porter. So that's kind of just a little interesting chunk of design history. But so I'd always wondered about the reinvention of Anchor Steam. And Fritz Maytag took over in the mid-1960s, put a lot of money in it, started building it up. There he is there with Phil Farrell's famous chicken.
Yeah, he's on the story here, or he's on the screen here for the video watchers.
Yep. And so after a lot of took me quite a while to get a hold of him. Finally got a hold of Fritz Maytag. Kind of a thrill to talk to him, and we had a great conversation. And this is the story he told. He's like, "Well, we thought, we were making a lot of accidental lambic back then. Beer was awful. It had a lot of sugar in it. It was often very sour. We had the cool ship upstairs, and the whole thing, and it was terrible beer. So it's like, let's fix this beer." So they thought the first thing is let's make it an all malt beer. And that was really a pretty radical idea at the time. There were no all malt beers in the United States at that time. Maybe some imports that were coming in, but not that many of those. And maybe one all malt beer, but generally not all malt beers. So that was pretty radical. And he said, "Well, we didn't know anything about malt really, so we called the malt guy." And the malt guy says, "Well, we got this malt. It's called crystal malt. It's got a nice kind of chewy, raisiny sort of texture. You might like that." And Fritz goes, "Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Send us some of that." And so then he thought, well, by God, let's put some hops in it. He'd been over to England, traveling around in Europe, and like so many early people in the craft beer scene, found beer culture and discovered hops and came back. It's like, let's do that. And so they found a guy in the industry that knew something about hops. And the guy says, "Well, there's this hop called Northern Brewer, kind of a new hop. It's only been around a few years. Not many people are really using it. It's got this nice, dry, clean bitterness. You might like that." And Fritz says, "Yeah, send us some of that. I think we could use that." And that's it. That's the story. And I recently talked to Mark Carpenter, and he more or less, who was the brewmaster there, now more or less retired. But he pretty much verified that story. So it's funny, we have a whole style category based on this very specific beer that was just sort of cooked up out of whole cloth.
I mean, that's the only surviving beer, right?
Yeah, but it doesn't really have anything to do with steam beer historically. It's a modern, and what's great about that story is what that means is that beer is for sure the first American craft beer, because it has all the hallmarks of what we would think of as essentially a modern American craft beer. It's all malt. It's got crystal malt in it. Like almost cannot live without crystal malt over here in the United States. It's really, really characteristic of so many beers, and it's got a really uniquely characterful hop. So those elements really set the stage and set the tone for American beer, up to today. So in a way, like the old story is kind of nice and charming, and you think, well, it's kind of sad that the old story is not true, but actually the real story is more interesting. And that's also often the case with history, that the real story is more meaningful. There's more places to go from it. And, that's another great thing about doing history.
So Anchor's probably the first American craft beer.
Not probably, without a doubt. No question, hands down, positively, the first American craft beer.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Randy, we're running a little short on time, but I was wondering if there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, not really. I think everybody ought to get their hands on. One of the things that's been really fun about doing some historical work is trying to brew up some historical beers. I think, we're always looking for inspirations. We're always looking for ideas. And so get your hands on these old recipes and try and brew them up. Even no matter how weird they look, usually when you brew them, you think, wow, those old guys knew a thing or two. And so it's just a richer way of understanding beer to absorb it from different people's points of view. So very highly recommended. Get your hands on it, do it. I should also mention that there will be a historical brewing conference in historic Williamsburg, run by a guy named Frank Clark, who's the brewer there, but also the director of historic foodways. I think it's going to be the third weekend in March. I think Ron and Martin are going to be there. Stan will be there. I think somebody from White Labs is going to talk about yeast genomics, and there should be a lot of good things. I'll be opening and closing with two different talks, so it should be a pretty good event. So if you're into this topic, we'll see you there. Well,
thank you, Randy. I appreciate it. Randy, thanks again for being on the show. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, no, my pleasure, Brad. Always really great to talk to you.
So my guest this week was the one and only Randy Mosher. Randy is author of Mastering Homebrew as well as Radical Brewing. He also has another new book out called Beer for All Seasons. He also has a new website at randymosher.com. Thanks, right. Randy.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks again to Randy Mosher for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, where you can get your 15% discount on their magazine or anything in their store if you use the offer code BeerSmith 2015 when you shop at beerandbrewing.com. Again, use the offer code BeerSmith 2015 and get your subscription now at beerandbrewing.com. And also BeerSmith Mobile, the perfect brewing app for your iPhone, iPad, Android, or Kindle Fire device. Learn more about creating great beer recipes with BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on Google Play, iTunes, or the Kindle App Store. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.